Welcome. That was bad. So welcome back to Super Politics, guys. Thank you for continually listening. We have an incredible episode today because we are going to talk about the dirtiest word in America.
What is it?
And poop? It's not mud. It's not poop. Nope. We are talking about Marxism.
Ah!
Yes. I know you're afraid. I know all you think Marxism is starving children and starving dogs and violence. But as we're going to find
Trump
out today,
arresting people.
And Trump arresting
who call themselves Marxists.
And Joe Biden being a Marxist, as Trump has called him.
Yeah, let's just start the whole episode off by clarifying that when we say Marxism, we are not talking about Joe Biden. I think that we should just be set up front.
Well, okay. I think we all know that Joe Biden is an anarcho-communist. I think the best way to describe
he wants a stateless society. Yeah, that's definitely true.
Definitely. So yeah, we're going to kind of get into the basics about Marxism, and then we have Ben Burgis coming on, who is a philosophy professor, and has written extensively about debunking the right's claims on a lot of things. Is going to help us debunk a lot of myths we have with Marxism today. Yeah,
Ben Burgis specifically specializes in Marxism. Really, he has a great podcast called Give Them an Argument that we are fans of. And he also has a book by the same name, and we'll drop the link in the description. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy. Someone that we really respect his opinion on Marxism. And so we thought, how better to have an episode about what this ideology is and what it's not, and have him kind of debunk some of that with us. So we also have our extraordinaire producer, Peter Pants. You can see him if you're watching the video, which we'll put on our Patreon. He's right there with his X-Files poster in the background.
Yes. I want to believe, it says, and that's in reference to I want to believe in America.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I am waiting for evidence to support my belief.
I'm conflicted about I'm conflicted about X-Files because it is one of my favorite shows. But now that I look back with all the police abolition stuff going on, it's like, man, but he was a cop.
See, I'm pro Agent Mulder because he's like the counterculture within the FBI. He's the guy they have to stick in the basement and give all of like the ludicrous crappy cases because he's so anti-authority within his own structure.
Right.
So
he's like an anti-cop. Like, yeah, he is a cop kind of, but his literal job is to like, or what he spends his time doing in any case is like finding corruption within the government and all the secrets and all that shit. That's what makes the show so good, you know? So, I mean, you don't have to be a cop lover to like X-Files. I think it's actually quite the opposite. I would stand by that.
All right. Well,
exactly. You know. And I have a hunch that Ben Burgis is a fan of the X-Files as well. So we'll have to see about that.
We'll see. Yeah. So anyway, guys, yeah. What else is going on in the news today? We Trump has COVID.
That's or
does he?
Well, he has it, guys. Come on. Let's stop with this conspiracy right now.
Yeah,
he has it. Mainly because everyone has it who's a Republican. When you sign up to register to vote, they give you complimentary COVID, apparently.
Yeah.
I saw Chris Christie is now in the hospital, so this is getting kind of wild. I saw Joe Biden with the kind of like sneaky attack, like, oh, hey, we're gonna pray for you and we're gonna take our negative ads out of you, but he's gonna keep campaigning, which I just kind of thought it was a little tongue in cheek in my personal opinion.
Man.
Like, do you want to know some of the Q conspiracies about it?
Oh boy, what do we got?
So one of the Q conspiracies is that Trump isn't actually in the hospital. Do you want to know where he is?
In some
military
military
base? There. No, he's out there saving the children himself.
Personally?
Ooh.
Personally, he's out
saving
there
what children.
Saving
yeah,
the children that have been getting eaten alive by the deep state.
Yeah, this is a fundamental premise of Q. I've mentioned it multiple times on the show, and Decatur has been pointing it out to me that I keep repeating it. But the QAnon conspiracy believes that there is a deep state that is like fucking eating children and shit, and it's like, or drinking their blood or whatever. It's like it's about like sex trafficking and stuff and all this other thing. And so Trump, This is the Q conspiracy that say he actually isn't sick. He had to personally Rambo this shit.
So it's like one of three conspiracies that I've seen. Another one is that he's in the hospital to protect himself as the deep state tries to take him out before he starts the storm of arresting all of the deep state Democrats.
Sure.
So naturally, it's like, well, apparently the White House isn't protected enough, right? So let's go to a hospital. That seems, I guess, more secure to him. I'm not really sure. But yeah, so I guess he moved there for protection.
That is cringy. That's a cringy belief that anyone is saying that to each other. I mean, even if you are a full-on QAnon, supporter, like there is no reason for Trump. Have you seen him walk? Like he has no coordination. The guy is not in good shape, and he is not the right guy to send out like Rambo style to go save the kids. Even if you believed in all that, like it's a bad idea. More importantly, like this is just a really wild time for the news. They're calling it the Rose Garden Massacre with all these Republicans ending up with coronavirus. So it's just a wild time for the news. So anyway, thought we'd start off with that, but back to the main topic here. What we want to do.
So democracy is burning in America and your president's in the hospital. Let's talk about Marxism.
Yeah, no. And we're going to release this probably a little bit later. So God knows what development there's going to be since we recorded this. But we're recording this right now on October 4th. For the record. So it's probably going to be released a bit later. But what we're actually going to do with this episode, what we hope it's helpful. None of us are Marxist experts by any means. We have very introductory knowledge about I'm sure that everyone the point is everyone has different ideas of what Marxism means. Trump has one take. Biden probably has another take. We don't really care about their takes. What we're interested in on this episode is what do people who actually call themselves a Marxist or study Marxism, like Ben Burgis, what do they think about it? Right. And in those groups, there's a million different definitions.
Right. And I think it's a good topic for us to start at least having the dialogue now, because I think I can comment, at least from my perspective, it's the first time ever I can really imagine where this has been this much class consciousness and people are really starting to pay attention to, the inequality and a lot of, economics going around in the world. So I think it's a really important time to be having this, even as we face off with two presidential candidates who have not one single Marxist policy.
Yeah, and this is something we've been talking on our show since literally the first episode is like this year especially is time to re-examine the way our society is set up, right? Like why do we have so much wealth in this country and yet such a inability to get that wealth to the people who need them during the pandemic? Marx's kind of specialty was to start off with diagnosing what our society is. And so he was one of maybe the leading thinker in what is capitalism, right? Like what is it and what's wrong with it? Right. And so that's kind of Marx's key observation is like our current society. One of them is our current society is set up with, two really major classes is like the have-nots being the working class and then the haves being the people who own the shit that is necessary to produce what we need to survive. This is a very elementary, kind of observation. And I know that there's way more fundamental stuff about Marx that we're not going to get into in today's episode. Today is more about the economic observations that he has. And really, what we want to do is like debunk all this negative shit about Marxism. And like none of us are even here saying like we hope you walk away from this episode calling yourself a Marxist. We just want to give you more clarity as to like how very ridiculous it is when Trump says like all these Marxists are trying to destroy our society. And like that is literally like the absolute wrong approach to Marxism.
I'll even go further and just say, a large swath of the right now, the mainstream right, has really just been attacking Marx and Marxists, who obviously they're pointing to a lot of people who aren't Marxists, but say everyone that they called were Marxists. They're not out for blood. They're not out for, just murdering everybody. And we all just live in extreme poverty as one class. And there's a lot more, nuance. And really it's about like helping the actual working class and lifting us up in a much better position. So I think that's
giving power to the working class is like the end game, I think. And whatever that ends up looking like and however you get there is something that people have debated after Marx. All this stuff that is the more scary side of people who call themselves Marxists that you probably are thinking about when you think of Marxism. That is one thing that some people chose to do with Marxist philosophies, but there's a way bigger ideology, and there's a much more like freedom driven ideology of Marxism that you'll hear Ben Burgis talk about today. And so really what we just want to do with this episode, it's almost not even fair to call it an introduction to Marxism. It's almost just like, we're going to talk about what it's not. We're going to try to like stigmatize the word for you. So when you then do go and hear more about Marxism and you hear people talking about it, you'll be equipped with the tool to say, okay, well, I know you're scared that, when you say Marxism, what you're talking about is Stalin, Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. And that is not, like, Karl Marx never endorsed Stalin, right? Like his writings predate Stalin.
People call themselves Marxist-Leninists. And the fact that there's a second name already proves that that's not Marx in his pure form, right? So I think that really does show that take out this like Soviet Leninist, Stalinist thing that you're thinking of, because Marx is something different. And Marx obviously, predates what Joseph Stalin was doing.
Marxism is, to me, and with my elementary understanding of it, is a philosophy and some observations about economics and a kind of philosophical framework to interpret society. And it's also a kind of set of morals, a set of principles that we want to achieve. And so how you get there is a matter of dispute. It is a matter that Marxists among themselves dispute heavily. So, it doesn't have to be that if you hear someone say, oh, I'm a Marxist, like, it was highly publicized that some of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement call themselves trained Marxists, right? The right was really hanging on that. Like, look, Black Lives Matter is a Marxist movement. Well, that doesn't actually mean really anything scary at all. It means at base level that, depending on what they mean about it is up to them. But just the word Marxism itself just means like, oh, these are people who have studied what Marx talked about. And one of the things Marx talked about is the economic injustices in capitalism. And that's not a scary thing at all. In fact, if you want to defend capitalism and you're not familiar with the, critique of it, then you're not really a great defender of capitalism. You have to know what's wrong with the system you're advocating for.
Economic injustice, I mean, that's not a left or right issue. You turn on Fox News, Tucker Carlson talks about that every night. So this isn't some myth that Marxists have just created in their head. Like, this is a real issue that literally everyone across the political spectrum is trying to figure out right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So without further ado, let's bring on Ben Burgis, and then we'll talk a bit more after the interview. We really hope that you guys find this helpful. But if you don't, then just go fuck yourself.
Right.
I'm just kidding. All right. I hope you enjoy it.
Hey, Ben, how you doing?
Hello. Good morning.
Good. How are you?
Good.
Hey, good morning. Good morning.
Joining us.
We're going to do like a little bit of a really base level primer on Marxism in this episode. And we thought, like, who better to have on than you?
We kind of tried to, I guess, survey some people that we know and some listeners, just try to get an aspect, because I think there's a huge thing right now with the word Marxism that's like super poorly represented. We have Donald Trump calling Joe Biden a Marxist, which, of course, we all know Joe Biden's the biggest Marxist in America, of course. But so I guess like a big question that I got a lot, which seems to be of much controversy to all my friends, at least, is, can Marxists be democratic, or does it have to be this like huge like revolution?
Okay. Before I answer, I just want to say I really appreciate that Pete, in his background, has Agent Mulder as beliefs.
That's all right.
Spent a lot of hours of my life watching that show in the 90s.
Yep.
But yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. It depends what you mean, right? So I think there are two different questions here that should maybe be disentangled. So one of them is the like vision of socialism you're talking about democratic, right, as opposed to like the sort of authoritarian Soviet style system, and the other one is how do you get there? Do you work within, the democratic or half democratic institutions, that we have right now, and I, even though, like, I think it should be democratic in both senses, and in fact, I think Marx might have views that people might not expect him to have on both questions. Like, I do think we should separate those. So, so on the first question, for sure, right? In that sense, you know, if you read Marx, it's a radically democratic vision, right? The like the whole objection to capitalism in the first place is that under capitalism, only a minority of the population owns businesses, and the rest of the population has no realistic choice except to submit to the domination of the first group, right? That's and so, you know, when Marx talks about socialism, really when anybody before like the Russian Revolution in 1917 talks about socialism, what they mean, broadly speaking, is some form of society where that's reversed, right? Where it's no longer the case that most people have to be ordered around by a small minority of people, you know, during 8 out of the 16 hours of every day that they're awake. That you can have what Marx usually calls like cooperative ownership, you know, of the means of production. That, you know, that workers will control the means of production, which I know is kind of a, like, that phrase sounds kind of like anachronistic and clunky, but I mean that's just a way of saying, like, you know, factories, stores, whatever, right? Stuff like that.
Right.
And sometimes people get the impression, and so like the idea is, right, that under pre-capitalist societies, right, feudalism, you know, then you know, ancient Roman slavery, whatever, you know, people are typically forced to work for, or in the case of like maybe farmers in some feudal system, like give up some of their labor to a ruling class, like directly, like at the point of a sword or something, you know. And capitalism relative to that is progress, because under capitalism, you don't have that kind of direct coercion, right? Nobody like goes to your house and sticks a gun in your face to make you go to work. But you have this kind of soft economic coercion that you have to go work for a boss or else you're not going to be able to eat. Right. And to the extent that that's not true, of course, that's because of past worker struggles to get some kind of welfare state to soften that. Right. And so in the original conception, right, this socialism is supposed to be an expansion of freedom, right? So capitalism is better than feudalism or slavery, right? Marx was very enthusiastic about the Union cause in the Civil War, even though, you know, slavery is being replaced by capitalism, you know, not socialism. But it's still, you know, but it's not good enough, right? You know, that if workers, you know, band together to get rid of capitalism and own the means of production themselves, that would be better. And I think oftentimes when people get the impression that Marx has an undemocratic idea of what a society, you know, after the revolution or whatever would look like, it's because there's this phrase that he and Engels use, not very often actually, like maybe like half a dozen times over the course of their like super extensive collected writings, the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning the rule of the working class. And so people key into that word dictatorship and say, oh, okay, he's not advocating democracy, he's advocating dictatorship. But I think that misses the idea a little bit. So so when he talks about dictatorship, it's a reference to Roman history, where you'd have normally you know, like in the Roman Republic, they had all these institutions set up to make sure no one individual could get like king-like power. You know, certainly wasn't a democracy, even in the most generous interpretation of that, right? But they did at least want to make sure, you know, no individual got too much power. So you'd have like the Senate and then two consuls who could override each other's decisions, you know, could check each other. But sometimes in a state of emergency, like, you know, there's you know, one of the wars they were always fighting got really intense or whatever, right? You know, there's a slave revolt, something, right? Then having two guys, like having executive power in the hands of two guys who could constantly veto each other got unwieldy. So they would have, you know, one guy do it for a year or something, right? You know, that was a dictator in the Roman sense. And so when he talks about the dictatorship of the proletariat, there's the idea is, remember, it's not of an individual, right? It's
Mhm.
of the proletariat, of the working class, right? Is the, which is all the proletariat means there. And so the idea is that during the transition to socialism, the working class is like imposing its will on the capitalist class by taking away their stuff and all that, right?
Right.
Which is like a Roman dictatorship, a temporary situation, because ultimately you're going to have a society where you don't have one class imposing its will on others, because you're not going to have different classes.
Right.
Mhm.
And actually, I mean, I know this is kind of a rabbit hole, but just to like wrap it up, right? They have the one time that Marx and Engels, like when Marx and Engels talk about the dictatorship of proletariat, like it's not just hypothetical. They actually pointed a specific historical thing that happened to show what they mean, right? And the specific thing that actually happened they point to is the Paris Commune in 1871, which is this incident where during the Franco-Prussian War, there's a bunch of like workers and soldiers in Paris take over the city government and run it for themselves. And if you read Marx's book about that, The Civil War in France, the features of the Paris Commune that he points to that he likes are all this like radically super democratic stuff, right? Like they have a like every state, like every official in the commune can be recalled by their constituents at any time for any reason. Nobody can be paid, like nobody in the government can be paid more than the average salary of a skilled worker. Factories that were abandoned by capitalists who fled from Paris to Versailles were like taken over as like worker cooperatives. Like this is all the stuff he liked about it, right? So when he talks about dictatorship of the proletariat, he's not talking about a one person or one party dictatorship in that sense, right? He means the rule of the working class in this super democratic sense. And even on the other question, this thing about, okay, do you work within democratic institutions or do you try to overthrow them? I mean, I think that Marx doesn't write that much about this, and I think if you know, like you can just point to things here and there, right? Like, so he spends a lot of time talking about revolution in the violent sense, but when he's talking about that, he's mostly talking about European countries that are still ruled by like kings or emperors. So there really is no way for like a socialist party to just take power electorally. And in fact, when you started to get countries like England that did gradually extend the franchise, the right to vote to most working class men, at least, over the course of the 19th century, then he starts to change his thinking on that, right? Like he says several times, hey, on the continent, right, we're going to have to use force, but here, in England, where he was stationed for most of his adult life, or in America, he gives example. I think he says maybe Switzerland, but he doesn't know enough about it, right? Then like in those places, then it might be possible for a socialist party to just take power through like existing institutions. And then he's worried that you're going to get, he's worried that the capitalists would react to that with violence, by doing the equivalent of what slaveholders in the South did when Lincoln was elected. But he thinks that like at least initially coming to power, can happen electorally. And actually, I guess I know it's been a really long answer, but I mean, just one last thing on that, right? That like the funny thing about that, like I always think is really funny about this is when people say, "Oh, Marxism is clearly like undemocratic; it's authoritarian." And they point to 20th century governments, right? Dictators who were born after Marx died, right? Who said they were influenced by his ideas to show that. But then like it's a really weird standard because no other philosopher from the 18th or 19th century do we apply that standard to, right? Like in fact, like John Locke, who like liberals and libertarians love, right, was like personally involved in horrifying things like the dispossession of Native Americans and slavery, right?
Yeah.
Like both, it's like given like he had like a job like writing the Constitution for the South Carolina colony, right? So whereas Marx, not only was the stuff he advocated actually very democratic, but there were no dictators or anything who existed at the time that that he lived who he praised. In fact, the only head of state who he ever liked enough to even send a friendly telegram to was Abraham Lincoln.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's wild to me that, you know, he was at least trying to be pen pals with with Abraham Lincoln, which I think is insane because I mean, partly due to the you know, the whole Jordan Peterson world that we live in now, which is another reason why we thought, you know, you'd be great for this because, you know, you talk to the average person who you know now, and what they know about Marxism is just the phrase cultural Marxism,
Right.
you know, and I don't know. I mean, I know Steve and I have both tried to read certain parts of Marx. Admittedly, it is not exactly my favorite author by any stretch of the imagination. It's a I personally haven't seen much about him talk about culture. Is there something that's like being perverse that he said that is like getting all these IDW guys to talk about him in that way?
Not really. No, like Marx doesn't talk much about culture. And you know, you do get, I mean, I guess the sort of half germ of truth in the cultural Marxism thing is that you do get 20th century Marxists like Gramsci, Adorno, who are very interested in culture, but that's because they see that as like kind of a gap, like in classical Marxism, because in some ways, so like for a long time, the main socialist party in the world was the German Social Democrats, the SPD, and when like early 20th century Marxists, people like Kautsky, like really had this idea. Like if you look at the way they wrote about it, it's like, hey, they're doing like a little bit better in every election, right? This is just sort of this natural thing that as workers come to realize their economic interests, you know, they'll in greater and greater numbers, you know, they'll vote the SPD into power, and then we'll have socialism, right? And you know, then even like people like Lenin, who didn't think it could, you know, happen that way at a certain point, right? You know, that like thought there did have to be violent revolutions, at least thought that would happen, right? You know, that pretty much inevitably. And then by the time you get to like, you know, the mid 20th century, like, well, okay, like clearly it's more complicated than that because look around, right? You know, like we're still living under capitalism, you know, in most of the world at least, you know, there's still and there have been like 2 world wars where workers have like mostly like taken up the arms of their country to like, you know, to kill each other,
Right.
And so clearly there isn't this like automatic relationship between economic interests and politics. The people aren't just going to realize, oh yeah, they're like the system, you know, like the system is bad for me, so now I'm going to support socialism and, you know, and all that stuff. So so you need some way of figuring out like why not, right? You know,
right, definitely.
Which is why people like Gramsci become really interested in culture. It's also why some 20th century Marxists start getting really interested in like Freudian psychology and stuff like that, right? You know, just like, okay, what else is going on here?
Yeah.
And so there are Marxist theorists in the mid-late 20th century who are very interested in culture, and that's true. But when people talk about cultural Marxism, they're not really talking about like these like esoteric Frankfurt School philosophers for the most part, right? Like what they're talking about is like any kind of cultural progressivism that they can like go back and, you know, like make it sound scary by associating it with Marxists, right? You know, it's, you know, like it's like you know, people having like gender pronouns in their Twitter bios is cultural Marxism, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think that everything you're talking about, to take a step back a little bit, you know, it really does touch on the cultural perception of Marxism, which is that Marxism is government coercion. I think you already talked about that's not really what Marxism is about. It's more about, you know, a worker controlled society, right? Where the proletariat actually runs the show.
Yeah.
But this perception, right, they're trying to apply this misconception about Marxism to every area of life. So cultural Marxism is both not what Marx talked about and based on a misconception of Marxism itself, which is that this is some, you know, coercive state where we're going to come in and force equality on people at gunpoint. And to take it a step further, the most arguments you'll hear from people who misunderstand Marxism, even well-meaning, you know, people on maybe even the left, would say that the ultimate result of that will be mass poverty and suffering, and we're going to end up in some 1984 situation. And I think that, like,
Yeah.
Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead. Yeah, please.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say. I mean, look. I mean, on the coercion point, like, I mean, it's certainly true, right? That like, if you're gonna be any kind of socialist, then presumably you do want to like, take away a lot of the property of of the people who have the most of it. They your Jeff Bezos and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And involuntarily, right? Like like that.
We're not going to ask his permission. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going to ask his permission. And look, really, if you're going to be, I mean, we can even broaden it out from socialism, right? If you're going to be any kind of leftist, right? Like you are going to say that, right? Because at the very least, even if you don't want to do what I'd like to do, right, which is like take away Amazon from him and nationalize it or turn it into a worker co-op or whatever we do, right? Like, even if you don't want to do that, right, you at least want to take away like a big chunk of his bank account, right, to fund social programs and whatnot, right, and that's so like that would be like the libertarian point that like that is all government coercion,
right.
And fair enough, right? Although I've always really liked Matt Brudig's point about this, which is basically that like government coercion bad doesn't actually get you very far because whether you're like enforcing existing property relations or changing them, right? It's just as coercive in either case, right? That like that if I say like if you take if Decatur takes steals my TV and then so like I report him
A likely
to
scenario. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it'll probably happen.
IMO.
Yeah.
Seems like it, right?
Yeah.
And then like so I immediately forgetting the fact that I don't like the police, right? I file a police report and they go to his house and they take, presumably they arrest him, but also, right, like the part that matters for this, right? They take back the TV against his will, right? That's that's government coercion, right? Like you're taking something from somebody who currently has it against their will. But libertarian would say, well, that kind of government coercion is fine, right? Because I have a claim on the TV. It's mine, right? That I have a right to the TV. And then the Brunig point would just be okay, but now we're not really arguing about coercion good or coercion bad. We're arguing about who has a right to what, right? Like and that's really what the argument should be about.
That actually helps my understanding quite a bit. I think that makes sense because this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. I started thinking about it. We did an episode with journalist Ellis Coase a few weeks ago on this idea of like Facebook's stance on not regulating speech, right? Well, one of the points that we were thinking about is not regulating speech, or as we would talk about in Marxism, not regulating the economy is not actually a neutral decision. What you're saying is that the only function I want the government to serve is to enforce the status quo that we currently have. But it's still, like you said, a method of coercion. We're still saying that we want who currently has power to keep having power. We're just not going to use the government to shift that at all. So there's we're going
to use the government to keep that the way it is, right? Which could actually, like, if your concern is just about like literally minimizing the amount of government coercion going on, right? Like you want, fewer people to be, made to do things at gunpoint. You want fewer people to be arrested, whatever. Then that could actually have the opposite effect, right? Because it could be that if you have a wildly unequal distribution of wealth, you actually have to lock up a lot more people because just to protect the property of the people who have most of it against everybody else.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's something that
that's a really good point. I don't remember Paris Hilton stealing shit all the time.
Yeah. So. I mean, I guess there's Winona Ryder, right? But like that's an outlier.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
Pete, you must have. I was going to see if Pete was waiting on a question or not.
Oh yeah, I was going to comment. I thought the example you gave with stealing the television was really helpful, especially for people like me who are very naive to some of these ideas. kind of about Marxism and property ownership and things like that. I was wondering if we could rewind a little bit. You mentioned that one of the maybe misunderstood concepts is about kind of having the workers control the means of production. And I think that's, very much a far cry from what we have going on in, our society today in America. But I wonder if you can comment on what that might look like if we could shift to that position where the workers would have some kind of control over the means of production.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to say, by the way, on the cultural, Marxism point, since Steve brought up Jordan Peterson earlier, that I think that what's in my experience, I think maybe even him himself, but like certainly people who are like fans of what he says about this stuff, what they'll often tell me at a certain point in this conversation is, okay, so maybe pronouns and Twitter bios isn't literally Marxism, but it's like Marxism, right? And then then the move is going to be that, well, look, just like Marxists say that workers are being oppressed by capitalists, then social justice warriors say that I don't know, gay people are being oppressed by straight people, whatever, right? And think, okay, but if that's what you mean by Marxism, right, just the idea that that there's ever a case where one group is unjustly oppressing another group, then Marxism predates the birth of Karl Marx by all of human history, right? Everybody, everybody involved in the French Revolution was a Marxist. The author of the Book of Exodus was a Marxist, right? There's a lot of, it's not hard to find pre-Marx claims that oppression exists in the world. But yeah, I mean, I guess as far as Pete's specific question about what solving the particular form of oppression that Marx is most concerned about would look like, I think what Marx actually says about this is not very much, and it's mostly not very helpful. So the places where, he's enthusiastic about the Paris Commune, although I certainly don't think he thinks it went all the way to achieving full socialism or whatever. He uses a lot of phrases in his writings about workers taking over the means of production. And there's a book, there's a little thin book, pamphlet called The Critique of the Gotha Program, which was when that German Social Democratic Party was first being formed. They're at this Congress in the city of Gotha in Germany. They had their Unity Congress, and they put forward this platform document, and he wrote this thing to circulate among the delegates criticizing it. Although interestingly enough, showing that Marx was a lot more savvy about this stuff than a lot of subsequent Marxists. It wasn't published in his lifetime because he didn't want to undermine his political allies, by airing this in public. Yeah. So that's something I think a lot of later Marxists have a very hard time imagining them making that decision. But anyway, in there, there are 2 or 3 paragraphs in there about how a post-capitalist economy would actually work. And there's some interesting stuff in there, but overall, I think, in my view, at least, it's not super helpful or convincing. I think that's if you agree with him that workers taking over the means of production is a important goal, right? Then I think you have to supplement, what he says about it, and maybe even disregard some of what he says about it, because some of the details, I think, I'm not convinced are that well thought out, right? It's very vague, right? But I think there are other socialists since Marx who said things that were more useful on that, right? So one example I really like is there's a guy named David Schweikart, who has a background in I think he went to grad school first for economics and then philosophy, and he wrote a book called After Capitalism back in the 90s, I think. Or there was I think the edition I read like I think probably came out in like 2002 or something, because there's like an introduction where it talks a little bit about 9/11 and the war on terror and stuff, but you get the sense that this was something that was like added at the last second.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's like, oh, it'd be weird if I didn't talk about this now, you know. So
Yeah.
but what he talks about in there is, well, actually, sorry, let me just back up half a second, right? Because I think the other thing that, like, the other big sort of post-Marx thing that has to be taken into account here is the like 75 years or whatever it was that the Soviet Union existed, you know, in all of those countries, because those are certainly attempts at creating some kind of totally non-capitalist economy.
Right.
And, you know, not one where the workers were really in control of anything in practice, but some kind of non-capitalist economy. And, you know, like, spoiler, it was not a smashing success, right? Like, you know, it was good at some things, you know, like really quickly producing lots and lots of tractors or lots and lots of tanks, and, you know, doing that kind of rapid industrialization, and, you know, thank God for it probably, or else the Nazis might have won World War II. But but it was very, very bad at a lot of other things, right? You know, like just sort of daily coordination of production with consumer preferences. So if you're a Soviet citizen showing up to the grocery store, right, like you just kind of had to hope that, you know, what you wanted to buy would be there, right? You know, like that's sort of the cliche about the Soviet economy, that you have like lots of rubles in your pocket, but like, what are you going to do with them, right?
Right.
And because that system didn't really create a lot of incentives for planners to, and really maybe even the ability, right, to like coordinate in that kind of nitty gritty way what was being produced with what people wanted to buy, which is what's sometimes called the calculation problem. And some Marxists will say things like, oh yeah, but the problem is the reason the planning didn't work in the Soviet Union is that it wasn't democratic. And of course, I think that if it was democratic, a lot of the problems with that system would have been solved, but I don't think all of them would have, right? So like just a little thought experiment, you kind of imagine the way the Soviet economy worked, and you sort of layer democracy on top of that, right? So you have, like, imagine a version of the Soviet Union where you had free speech and a free press and multi-party elections, and then like maybe whatever party got a majority in parliament, you know, that year's election, formed a government and appointed the head of the Soviet planning office, Gosplan. Well, in that scenario I just described, I think probably like the worst horrors of that system wouldn't have happened, because like you wouldn't have had, like, you know, the point in like the 30s when Stalin was allowing Ukrainians to starve to death, you know, because it was like actually like selling grain from there to like buy heavy industrial equipment. Like that wouldn't have happened if he'd had to worry about being reelected. But I'm not sure that the sort of daily frustrations of Soviet consumers would have been that much better if that had happened, right? Like, I don't think that version where there was some sort of democratically elected government that like ran the like Soviet planning office would have necessarily been better at that, right? So I think that the lesson that I draw from this, and, you know, this is certainly not a, you know, orthodox Marxist view, but I mean, I think it is true, right? Like, is that you probably, for any kind of socialist society you could imagine, like at least at this stage of history, you probably do need some kind of market mechanisms to solve those problems.
Right.
Which
like
doesn't have.
Yeah. The advantages of the incentives that we have in a free market. So, and that I think is a common misconception, that socialism doesn't necessarily have to lack markets, although we can talk about really good reasons that they might. But that like, it wouldn't be this like overnight thing that the Soviets tried to do, where it's like suddenly there's no markets, everything's centrally planned, although that might be kind of reducing the complexity of what happened in that country.
No, but I mean, roughly, right? You know, I mean, like everything is, you know, like, or almost everything, right? You know, is centrally planned. Like, so there's a really good book called Red Plenty by Francis Stafford, where he talks about, it's a, you know, that's basically like this broad view about like how all of that worked, and like what all the attempts to reform that were, and why none of them worked, right? And yeah, and look, I think it's possible that we could get to a place eventually where we didn't need those market mechanisms, that like that maybe in the future technology will get so good that that you can just have like algorithms do all the coordination, that markets do. I'm not ruling that out, but also I don't think you can count on that. Certainly not if you want this to happen anytime soon.
Right.
So,
but we are working towards that in a way. If you just look at what companies like Amazon already have in place, they are already using algorithms in order to accomplish like 1 day shipping or 2 day shipping. They're using algorithms to predict what areas will need so they can deliver that quickly. So of course, I agree. It's kind of like a fun thought experiment. It's not necessarily like what, people talk about, like fully automated, technological communism, which sounds great. Like, why wouldn't we just want to, technology to take care of all our needs for us? But to the extent that we don't have that yet, you're right. We need to think about like, well, how are we going to get this all distributed in a meaningful way? All right. Looks like we just lost Brent. So let me just, okay. We got Brent back on here.
Yeah. I've thought about this so much in the last, God, what is it? Like 15 years, 20 years, that we've had, Skype and now Zoom, because I think Star Trek really missed a lot of plot opportunities because when they did the video calls in there, it always worked.
Yeah. Right. Where are the dropped calls and all the drama that comes from it? So yeah, definitely.
So anyway, I know that was a lot of preface, but I think that But I was just going to say on the socialism thing. So what Schweikart says in After Capitalism is basically that you could have an economy, that was still basically a market economy, but you'd have public ownership of the actual physical infrastructure of factories and other kinds of means of production like that. But then you have private but worker-owned firms that would get their initial funding from grants from publicly owned banks that would then act pretty much the same way, right? That regular capitalist businesses do, but they'd be owned by the workers, again, the reason, because if you look at under really existing capitalist societies, you do have worker cooperatives, the most famous case is the Mondragon Corporation in Spain, which is this giant cooperative business, has 80,000 members, or I don't know how the pandemic has affected them, but they had 80,000 members in this giant worker cooperative, all kinds of little businesses within it. One of the biggest employers, the Basque region of Spain, right? But that's an outlier. Mm-hmm. That usually they're not that big, and it looks like if you look at the research on really existing worker-owned businesses, once they get going, they seem to work about as well as just regular capitalist businesses. That of course, they go out of business like any does, but the lifespan tends to be about as long. They work about as well, and so I think it seems like the question is, why is that such a tiny minority of the economy under capitalism? And it doesn't seem to be because they don't work as efficiently once they get going, right? It seems to be because it's harder for them to get started in the first place. It's not that the death rate is higher; it's that the birth rate is lower. And so part of the reason is if you think about a lot of different kinds of businesses, the actual initial capital costs, for starting it up are massive, right? Even ones that aren't that big necessarily. Think about if you have a really you're a dentist, right? And you have a small independent dental practice. I guess I've had to go to the dentist a bunch lately, so this is the example that's on my mind, but
I didn't think we'd be talking about the dentist today, but okay. Yeah.
So it's that could be a business that has 10 employees, but you have all these machines there that cost tens of thousands of dollars. And so it's, so the starter capital is wildly unequally distributed right now. And of course there are loans, but you're more likely to get a loan if you can have some reason to believe that you're good for it, right? And most people, if they tried, would not get one, right? That's so.
That's me.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna, so that's why Schweikart's conception, in order to have an economy that was actually dominated by worker-owned businesses, what you'd want to do is nationalize the banks, and then you'd have these publicly owned banks give out grants, which would be like loans, but you only pay interest essentially, right?
Right.
To buy all the expensive stuff and get things going. So I don't know. Maybe that was like a much more in the weeds answer.
I think it's perfect. Another, if we're thinking about like the traditional business, and one thing I think that was really helpful reading about Marxism to me is to kind of like reframe what capitalism is, right? And it's not just, free trade, everything's voluntary. It's actually maybe another more important defining feature is it's premised on the exploitation of those who don't have the resources to start a business, right? You either have the resources to start your own business, or you have to work for someone who does. And so your labor is, of course, worth more than what you're getting paid for it, or no one would hire you. And so that is, a form of exploitation. We're exploiting your labor to take out more value from you than you're getting for yourself. Basic level. What I've thought about is like, if another struggle is, even if we had a more low cost model, right? If I ever wanted to start my own law firm, for example, you could actually start a law firm these days really cheap. I could do it from right here on my computer. I just need a few software subscriptions. And if I wanted to start it myself, no problem. But if I wanted to get any partners involved and then start to have paralegals and secretaries, the issue I've thought about this before is if I ever wanted to do that, good luck trying to convince the other lawyers that I want to bring on my team to give up their ability to exploit other people. And of course, they wouldn't word it that way or think about it that way. But me trying to convince other lawyers who have the capacity to make, $300,000-$400,000 a year plus in a small firm and be like, hey, you know what? Wouldn't you actually be happier making $75,000 a year, but then the paralegal also makes $75,000 a year and has some say in how the firm is run and what kind of cases we take and that kind of thing. Well, good luck with that, because they went to school and they took all this debt and they're like, well, no, I've earned the right to exploit other people now. Again, they wouldn't word it that way, but that's kind of how I would rephrase their thinking.
No, for sure, right? I mean, because this gets us back to the voluntariness question, that nobody's, nobody ever really gives up a position of power, right? If they have the option of keeping it, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons I actually think it's kind of like weirdly beside the point to have like fainting spells about Donald Trump, like hiring a bunch of accountants to come up with like clever ways that he doesn't have to pay his taxes.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, I don't expect anybody to pay a penny more than they're legally forced to, right? I mean, that's how taxes work.
I agree. I mean, my family's Republican and they feel the same way. They're like, what's wrong with what he did? I mean, to the extent that it wasn't illegal, I don't know the details of it. Maybe there was some fraud involved, but I don't know. So to the extent that I have no doubt that he did exploit the system.
Yeah, totally. Right. Yeah. Quite a bit of it seems to have been legal. And even the stuff that's like maybe an illegal gray area. Well, if if he's doing this for years and years and years and the IRS isn't clamping down on it, then those laws aren't worth much, right? That's really more of a suggestion than a law.
Well, I'm coming from the rap world where everyone does tax fraud all the time, so I'd be a hypocrite if that was the thing that I was done with Donald Trump for.
Yeah, respect.
I'm kind of curious. So when I polled some people, something that came up a lot about Marxism is how individualism would work, and they have like a fear that maybe there's no sort of individualism under Marxism. I don't know if you could speak to that in any account.
What do you mean by that, Decatur? Are you talking about like individual freedom to choose your job? Because that's one thing I've heard about, like Cuba, like they force you to be a truck driver even if you hate trucks. Is that what you're asking about?
Right. And so it's like, do I have to do this if I want to be a musician? Do I want to be an actor? Do I want to start?
Yeah. Do I have to fill out a form to explain how much I love music? What about Pornhub?
Right.
What?
Yeah.
They're going to force you to be a pornographer. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Look,
Sorry
I
if
think
that
you
question threw you off.
well, I mean, I certainly, support everybody's right to post to Pornhub. I don't want to,
Right.
I don't want to stop that, but
Right.
yeah, I mean, look, I don't know if that's even quite true about Cuba. I've been, I've been to Cuba. It's certainly a very, very far from ideal society, but I don't think they're actually forcing people to, I don't know that they're actually like forcing people to make particular career choices, particularly. There's, I know they've been criticized for doing things like, like for example, if somebody, maybe like doing things like pressuring doctors to participate in certain kind of overseas missions, things like that. But I don't think anybody's actually like putting a gun to your head and saying that, that like you have to like go to medical school.
Right.
I think probably, I mean, actually, like, I think that's kind of an interesting example because in my guess is that is like in Cuba, I mean, like doctors aren't actually paid that well, like even like, I mean, maybe you get a little bit more, right? For being a doctor, but it's not a big gap, but they've still got like doctors running out their ears. And I think that and so I think probably social prestige is like just good enough, to make people want to do that. But look, I mean, going from Cuba to kind of socialism I'd advocate, I mean, I actually think there would be more opportunity for individual self-expression and also for like career choice, right? Because I mean, just starting on a basic social democratic level, right now in the United States, right now, lots of people don't go to college because they can't afford it. They don't want to be, they rationally don't want to spend decades paying off, student loans. Like lots of people who even would qualify for financial aid are intimidated by like the sort of bureaucratic hoops they have to jump through to do that. And so I think just having like free public higher education would free up a lot of people to pursue career choices they might not pursue if without that, right? And I also think just having more I think having more free time, right? So which you could have like I think one of the best things about having an economy where the predominant like economic unit would be a worker cooperative is if you like maybe to kind of go back to what Steve was saying about fully automated luxury communism, right? Even if you don't get there, right? If you think about how automation works under capitalism, well, if there's some labor saving device that lets the owner of the company that like only half as much human labor needs to happen as before, then the incentive is for the owner of the company to just lay off half the workforce and have the other half work as hard as ever, right? Which is what always happens. Whereas if the workers were democratically electing, either the management directly or whatever council, hired the management, then the incentive would be totally different, right? Like the incentive, if it, in that sense, right, if with labor saving technology, might be to just keep everybody on board for the same wages they were making before, but just cut everybody's hours in half,
right?
And I think that would be amazing as far as unleashing potential for individual self-expression. Like I think in a society where people had to work fewer hours a day, with no loss of income, right? I think we'd see, and look, I mean, I'm sure most of it would be terrible, right? That like lots of people with no musical talent whatsoever would be starting their own band, right? There would be tons of bad poetry being written, but like, but still, right? Like that, like I want that, right? Like,
but it's more freedom. Yeah, it's more freedom.
I want everybody to pursue their own dreams. It's
however terrible. Yeah.
As much as I'm sure a lot of them would be terrible dreams.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
And we've already dealt with a lot of bad poetry, so that we can handle.
Yeah, we can handle
handle it.
increasing the amount of bad poetry in the world.
Yeah.
That's right.
But I mean, even this
Definitely.
podcast is an example. I mean, we do this in our free time. I could only imagine like how much more we could do with it if we weren't all three of us full-time workers, and so
Totally, yeah.
Pete is a psychologist. Brent has all sorts of odd jobs, and I'm a lawyer, and like this is just an extra thing we do. And yeah, no, this is, I would love to spend more time on this. And so I think exactly that point is really well taken, that like in a truly more socialist Marxist society, one that maybe Marx would approve of, let's say, we'd have much more freedom. I think that's actually the same point we talked about with Nathan Robinson, is like, this is like a very common misconception, I think, of socialism in general, is that socialists want coercion and less freedom. And it's actually exactly the opposite, because of the ways the like actual material existence that we have right now. Yeah, maybe the government doesn't force you to do one thing or another, but your actual economic reality does. And so with socialists, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, and of course we don't want like obviously we want to go in the right direction, which is less coercion, not more, right? We want to get rid of the soft economic coercion of capitalism, rather than, of course, going back to direct coercion, which is what people will often accuse socialists or even social democrats of, right? Like my favorite stupid thing that people say about this is the Rand Paul thing of saying that, well, if you have a right to health care, that means that you have a right to doctor services. So like now the doctor is a slave, which is just deliberate equivocation, right? Because what we're saying you have a right to is not the labor of any particular doctor, because if they want to be a doctor, sure, right? Under a socialized system, they'd have to work within that system, right? But they don't have to become a doctor in the first place. What we're saying we have a right to do is the government picking up the tab for those medical services.
Yeah, and we're exactly no one. In fact, who's really even forcing the doctor to work? I mean, it's just like that's what he chose to do, and that's again another misconception. So, what I think this is the answer to this question is already abundantly obvious from this entire interview already, but just to reiterate for anyone who this really is kind of new to them. I think that a very common misconception of Marxism is that anyone who would call themselves a Marxist or who is open-minded to Marxism is by definition advocating for a Soviet form of government or the Cuban government. And like, there's of course a bunch of different ways to try to effectuate a more Marxist society. But I'd leave that to you. How would you respond to that accusation?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think I think that's just wrong. I think that I think if the question is like what Marx thought, right? Like when he was talking about socialism, what does he have in mind?
Right.
It would be different from either what I've advocated or what existed in the Soviet Union, right? It would be different from what existed in the Soviet Union because it would be super democratic. It would be different from what I've advocated, because I think Marx did assume that we could plan everything and have, like I said, he doesn't say much about it. It's mostly pretty vague, right? But but even like in ways suggesting that that we would the sort of technical Marxist language is overcome the commodity form, like we wouldn't even have money anymore, right? Stuff like that, right? Like, and which my view on all that is maybe someday, right? But but in terms of what could happen anytime soon, I think it would be closer to what I laid out earlier, which would be like Marx and unlike the Soviet Union in the sense of what he cares about, is workers collectively controlling the means of production, right? So I think that if the question is, well, what do people who call themselves Marxists think? Lots of different things, right? They disagree with each other about tons of shit, right? And then like if the question is what Marx thought, right? Then yeah, I mean, we talked about that. So, but it's like either, but in both cases, right? If the question is, would either Marx or later Marxists, right? Like is what they're talking about, like the kind of system that existed in the Soviet Union. That's like no in both cases, right? I mean, that's definitely not what Marx is talking about. And I think that, I mean, you can always find somebody who advocates anything, right? It's like right. There's a Cicero said, right? There's no view so ludicrous that's not advocated by some philosopher. Right? Like, you can always find somebody, but the overwhelming majority of people in, here and now, right, who call themselves Marxists are certainly not advocating, that kind of system. Mm-hmm. So I mean, I think in both cases, like, I think it's just kind of it's like, it's a little bit like if somebody says like they're a conservative, and I say, so like what you want is like Nazi Germany, huh? And they said, what? No. It's like, well, okay, but I mean, like, that's right. That's a thing that existed. That's, like, okay, right? But like, at a certain point, if you're just going to keep insisting that that's what somebody really secretly thinks, then I guess I don't really know like what anybody's supposed to learn from that, right? Like, you can either engage with what people are actually saying, or like choose to stop talking to them. But like, at a certain point, those are your choices.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, Ben, we really appreciate you coming on. We do have one last question that we've just been asking everyone on the podcast, and you can say you don't have to answer if you don't want, because it is stressful to everyone.
We know you're going to try to dodge the question, but we'll try to get it from you.
Dodge the question.
Yeah,
but we're gonna try to get it from you.
Yeah.
What do you think the election outcome is going to be coming up here?
Okay. If I had to put money down on it, I would say that Biden wins and he actually takes office in January, right? Like, I think that that's like the most likely thing to happen. Like I said, if I had to bet, that's what I'd bet. Also, I would not bet.
Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a bet you want to have to make.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Like,
we're all
like,
very nervous. We're all very nervous.
Because it's such a bizarre situation.
Yeah.
I mean, it was already a bizarre situation before Trump got COVID. It's like even more bizarre now.
Right.
I mean, in so many ways, it's uncharted waters. Like, I mean, I wouldn't want to like try to quantify the chances of like anything happening really. Like I was just, I've been lining up guests for the next several episodes of my podcast, and the person I'm talking to the week after the election, right? Like, I like the way I put it in the email was, you want to come on and talk about whatever will have by that point have happened.
Right. Whatever country we may or may not live in at that point. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fun, and it was definitely really cool to have you on, because like I said, we're fans of your podcast and your book and all the work you do. We read your stuff. I've been reading your article on Glenn Beck's book that you put out in the Current Affairs magazine. So I look forward to whatever else you put out. Awesome.
All right.
Great. Well, thanks, man. We appreciate it a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
So yeah, thanks again to Ben Burgis, who has given me a little hope. He wouldn't bet on it, but he seemed a little confident that Joe Biden would win, right?
Yeah, I mean, confident enough without putting money on it. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. But I mean, as someone who's broke, I wouldn't put money on it either.
It was nice to hear a little bit of optimism. Honestly, the whole coronavirus thing, I feel, has taken the wind out of Donald Trump's sails to some extent. I don't really see an angle on why he would fake this for the people who think it's not real.
Right.
But I feel like his campaign is kind of deflated by this whole thing and everything that's happening in the Republican Party. So
yeah,
I agree.
I'm optimistic for sure.
That's true.
I really appreciated Ben Burgis' take on this episode. Some of the stuff he said about Marxism actually debunks quite a things even for me. about like what my impression of what people who call themselves Marxists believe. It actually is way more consistent with like a democratic socialist vision in my view, at least the way Ben Burgis looks at it. And to me personally, I don't really see any harm, so to speak, in like people calling themselves a Marxist. Like your views are probably extremely consistent with mine. And and to me, like that really is our point. Like there's so much to go in with like, what did Marx actually spend his life writing about? He wrote for decades. What was it about? He had like different topics that he would address. And the one that we talked about mostly was like his economic observations and kind of like his way of like theorizing about what is capitalism. That's what we spent the most time on. And then, but to go beyond that and to talk about, well, how do we achieve a society that would not have those problems, which is certainly something Marx wanted, is up for debate. And what would Marx approve of? I think that Ben Burgis made a really good point that I really appreciated, which was like, well, there might be stuff that Marx would have liked that we don't owe any allegiance to this guy to be like, well, if Marx wouldn't have wanted it, then we shouldn't want it. Like, that's ridiculous. Like, let's take what we like about Marx's observations and ideas and what we still think is useful 200 years later, or, 150 years later, and then toss the rest. It doesn't matter.
And I think that's an important thing that he brought up too, is like, Marx is a template, right? It's not a Bible. So I think that there's, we're going to disagree with some things. He lived in a world without internet. I really appreciated when he was kind of talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat and just how different times were. It's like, well, yeah, like democracy as we know it now wasn't really working like that across the globe back then. So, of course, like, revolutionary takeover was a bit different. And yeah, like when he says dictatorship, it is more for the people. It's not literally about Stalin. And
well, if your idea of dictatorship, which would be a fair one because it's how it normally comes up, is one guy who literally has like all the power to command everything in society and no one questions him and everyone just follows his orders. And I say him, obviously
like a dick,
like a dick.
Has there been a female dictator?
Well, I mean, there's certainly been female monarchs. So to the extent that those are, similar. So anyway,
the queen of Aldovia from the Netflix. Yeah.
You keep bringing Aldovia up. I never want to hear about that again. Of course, the queen.
We're doing a whole episode on Aldovia. It's coming.
Oh my God. Okay, moving on. The idea of a dictator as one person being in control of everything is fundamentally the opposite of what Marx was advocating for, and he would be equally critical of that society, if not more critical than of a capitalist society. So when someone says dictator of the proletariat is the working class. There can be no dictator of the proletariat where the dictator is one person who owns and controls everything. That is an oxymoron. So that when Marx said the phrase dictator of the proletariat, he's literally talking about dictatorship of the proletariat. He's talking about a society where the proletariat is in charge. That is a good thing. In theory, that's what our country is supposed to be.
Yeah, and this is where I think terms like democracy in the workplace are helpful, because it helps us to see like what that would actually look like for, for the people in the workplace to have power. Right. And Ben was talking about cooperative type structures in the workplace where people come together to make decisions jointly in a democratic process. That's how people throughout your organization can jointly share power in a democratic sense. And it kind of debunks this view of dictatorship when everybody's participating in it.
Right. Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. It's this idea that like, we don't need one person to have all this power. And in fact, we could do things communally. Communism. Right. Like that's the idea, is like, we want to build a cooperative economy, not a competitive one, not one that's based on, and there can be competition in a communist society. It's not necessarily exclusive like we talked about. You can still have a free market in a communist society.
And I think that's actually, I think like that tidbit especially is really important, because I do think a lot of outsiders to even socialism think, they think everything's the same in a grocery store. That's like what the right always says, right? And like, and whereas he's pointing out, like that was a flaw of like the Soviet Union even, is like, well, who knows what's going to be in the fucking grocery store? It's like, we can design something that doesn't look like that, in the 21st century.
And honestly though, how many fucking flavors of Cocoa Puffs do you need? Like, I mean, let's just get real for a second. Like, if it's the choice to me, and I'm
Six is the answer, by the way.
6 is the answer. I know that people are really reluctant. They're like, fuck off with my Cocoa Puffs. I love them. Like, don't mess with it. I don't want to be forced to eat some generic brand, whatever.
Right.
Okay. True. Right. Like, that is an advantage of a totally competitive based, economy. But on the other hand, if we had to make that trade-off, and I don't think we do, if we did have to make the trade-off of like having fewer brands of cereal, for example, like think about what we're trading it for. We're trading it for the elimination of poverty, right? Like, don't be a dick. Stop being.
Well, and then that's
the idea.
We kind of talked about Amazon a little earlier. That's my favorite Twitter account online right now, is what Jeff Bezos is doing. And literally the tweet every day is Jeff Bezos woke up and decided not to end world hunger. Every day they just tweet that. And it's like, that's what he's doing. He has enough money and he's just,
No, and this is actually really interesting. And someone fact checked me on this, but I believe what Jeff Bezos said is that he doesn't know what to do with his massive wealth other than space exploration. That's it. He's like, well, it's the only thing that like I can do with my money. I have so much money. I don't want to waste it on social programs or some shit. Like, this is the problem that Marx was pointing out about capitalism, is like, now you have people who got to this position where they have that much power, right? Like he has, make no mistake about it, money and having access to stuff, like having control over production and having control over finances and all of that, that is power, right? You can think of it in two ways. Money gives you freedom. Money gives you power. They're kind of synonymous, two sides of the same coin. They let me control my own life, but they also give me power over other people's lives, right?
Right.
That's what all money really is.
Over outer space.
Yeah.
Right. And
so he has.
I've got
all
a
this
quote
power.
for you, Steve.
Go ahead.
I've got a quote for you from Jeff Bezos. The only way that I can see to deploy this much financial resource is by converting my Amazon winnings into space travel. That is basically it.
Winnings,
right?
He said
I like that he said winnings, because yes, when you gamble with business like this and make that much money, it's fucking luck.
These aren't earnings.
Right.
You can't
But it's also
possibly do
exploitation.
something to earn.
Well, that's what
money.
it is. He's lucky that his exploitation worked out. Yeah. I mean, to get to that fucking level of where he's at.
Yeah. And so and that's really the point. That's all Marxism is. Don't be, Marxism. Oh my God. It's literally just this theoretical framework of looking at capitalism saying, actually, if all we're talking about is free market and voluntary decisions, we're missing like maybe the whole point of the system, which is that it's a system where maybe the government, instead of it, kind of like centrally planning things, where the government is now allowing like unelected people to run everything and have control over all the shit. And like and now again, like I said during the interview, if you don't have your own resources to start a business, you have to work for someone who does. But let's take that a step further. Let's say you do have your own resources to start a business, and now we're in a competitive economy. Like the problem with competition is that someone eventually wins, right? And so if you have a business and then there's someone else who has a business, so a libertarian or a conservative would be like, great, this is how the system is supposed to work. We're supposed to have two businesses having two different, very similar brands of cereal, and they're going to continue to reduce prices and make it more accessible to everyone. The problem is like eventually someone will win that battle, right? And then one of those people will then have to not be a business owner anymore and go work for someone else. Right. That's the ultimate end game of this system is exploitation.
And I think that's very important. And in a system of capitalism where, especially how it is in America right now, exploitation is pretty much encouraged at this point. And when someone like Jeff Bezos wins, that means there's hundreds that lose, including his workers, right? So I think that's very telling to me. But yes, getting back to like the whole Marxism idea of like, I do think it would take a shift in culture to some extent to get to where we need to be in America too, for Americans at least. I don't know about the rest of the world, but to kind of get into a society where, like you said, we don't need 6 Cocoa Puffs. I do think there's a cultural change that needs to happen where I think hopefully with COVID and things like that, we're realizing like, hey, we can actually get by with a lot more minimum of shit than we think. Yeah. I don't know though, because then again, toilet paper was gone for like 3 weeks. So
yeah, but I mean, I think the bigger point, right? Like it's going to turn some people off. Like, no, I don't want to live in a society where there's less choice. Fine. I mean, if you think that's more important than eliminating poverty, then that's your choice. I agree with Decatur 1000% that we need to start having more conversations where we're not afraid to talk about things like Marxism, because what's really important that we do is start to identify the source of poverty. Like these little programs about like, let's like just fix things around the edges. Let's, you know, like the Joe Biden approach of like, everything is basically fine. Let's just fix a few things. Is like denying the actual real existence of so many people suffering under this current system. And that's bullshit. And we need to actually start having a really serious talk about like, not just how can we marginally improve their situation, but how can we like, that's like ultimately unsustainable to just be like, okay, capitalism is basically fine. We just need to improve a few people's conditions. Like, no, capitalism is actually a self-destructing form of economics and political, you know, it's a self-destructing political economy, because the people who are in charge of it are continuing to write the rules in favor of themselves, to continue to make us start to be, you know, accepting a lower standard of living, to continue to, you know, want to advocate for like lower minimum wage. There's this eternal battle that we should stop. In fact, the mass of people need to take control over this shit and actually start talking about like what are our actual priorities and how to create a system that isn't eternally in conflict with like really powerful people, and instead it is designed but in its base level to prioritize our own prosperity.
Right. I think that, you know, it's like the Marxist approach is actually like rebuilding the wall with the hole in it, as far as to what like a Joe Biden is saying is let's just keep putting duct tape over it and we can't see it. And like, that's not really going to solve anything in the long term. And some people might say, don't fucking build a whole new wall out of some new material, if that makes any sense. But, you know, Marxists are going to try at least.
I would probably use the analogy. I actually think about this all the time doing criminal defense, to the extent that like criminal justice is, I think, kind of a microcosm of this conversation, is that like in public defense, I'm doing important work. I'm helping individuals, right, in their own specific issues. But I also at times feel like I'm just plugging holes in a sinking ship, right? I'm running around the Titanic trying to like find where the water is coming in through the sides and just like plug it up. But then it keeps bursting out in other places because the ship is sinking. Because
that's a perfect analogy. Because you know what? Fucking capitalism is talking to Jack like I'll never let go, and everyone's just going to go down with fucking capitalism.
Yeah, but this is a great analogy, because there's actually enough room on that fucking floating door for everybody, including Jack. He did not have to sink to the bottom, and that's the point of Karl Marx.
And Blue Cross Blue Shield is the goddamn iceberg that takes us all down because we couldn't have healthcare.
I have no doubt that everyone is now confused. So if you want a takeaway from this episode, the point is this. And I think Ben Burgis would agree 1000%, which is that Titanic is a communist movie. No? Okay. Yeah. All right. We've lost the shark.
Leonardo DiCaprio.
We've lost the shark. I hope you got something out of this episode. I really enjoyed talking to Ben Burgis and hope to have him on for more conversations about like, okay, you know, Marxism or not, like how do we build this society where, you know, like we brought up a lot of issues we didn't really have answers for on this episode, but, you know, we hope to continue this conversation, not just us, but the whole society should be having, is like, well, yeah, how, for example, do we create an economy that is, you know, cooperative, that we all are making sure we're taking care of each other, but we still make sure there's enough shit in the stores and you don't have to fill out an application a week in advance to get a box of cereal or milk, right? Like there are benefits certainly to a market-driven economy. And like Ben Burgis pointed out, not every socialist is even like making that a priority to get rid of the markets, right? In fact, maybe we could just have competition still, but we give workers control over it and we just get rid of the bosses. You know, we'll still have managers. You know, there's a lot of detail we didn't go into in this episode about like what.
Well, yeah, and there's 1,000 questions for Marxism that we're not going to be able to answer within an hour and a half. But I think the important thing is a lot of these, you know, self-described Marxists and people who are sympathetic to the Marxist cause is really just looking at an angle like, listen, life as we know it isn't working and it doesn't have to suck this much. And that's really like what it comes down to. And it sounds simplistic, but that's really how we have to start looking at these things that are dirty words.
I agree. It's like, it's not this is something I mentioned in the episode before. And I think it's even maybe more relevant now in a conversation about Marxism. The people who have been trying very hard, spending a lot of money and a lot of effort to demonize Marxism stand to benefit so much from us never thinking about it. Right? Like the people in power want you to not think about this. I know I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it is literally true that if you look at who is demonizing Marxism, it's the people who benefit on the system that currently exists. And to the extent that you personally are listening to this episode and you're like, I don't know, I'm still kind of worried about Marxism. I'm not a powerful person, but I would challenge you to think, do I believe that because I've been told some lie about what Marxism is because it benefits someone else for me to believe that? That's kind of what we're getting at here. That's really all we were trying to do with this episode, is show you it's actually not a scary thing at all. In fact, it's a mandatory thing, in my view, that everyone should start thinking about, like, what's wrong with our current system.
Right. So yeah, we hope you guys learned something. If not, send us an email and tell us we suck, or
we'll
send us an
delete the
email and
email.
tell us we're great, because we are two white cis males and we need a lot of affirmations in our lives. And I think that even if you want to just comment about how great of a job Pete's been doing, just email us. Also, just to wrap up, subscribe to our Patreon, guys. There's so much great content that is coming out there, and you guys should just do that just because you love us and feel bad for us that we have to work regular jobs.
Yeah, we're going to try to be releasing. Recently, we've been releasing episodes more often on the actual podcast, but we're also releasing bonus content that we hope is actually valuable. And some of it, I'd like to release it all on the main podcast, but it's like a different format. So if you want to hear like more of a loose structure, just free conversation about things like the election, like the all of that stuff, like jump on our Patreon. It doesn't cost much at all, and it helps us keep this show going. Yeah, it helps us keep the show going, and that's really a great thing, because our voice is more important than every other podcast out there, and so it needs to keep going. So that's all I got for this week. Closing thoughts, Pete?
If you have more questions on Marxism or leftist rhetoric, make sure you check out Ben Burgis's book.
Yeah, check
called,
out. It's called "Give Them an Argument for the Give Them an Argument," and it's logic for the left, and it will help you see all the fucking dumbass fallacies and shit that the right wing uses. He also has another book that helps kind of break down some of Jordan Peterson's bullshit. Look at his articles on Jacobin, or just YouTube the guy, because since he's more famous than us, you can't search super politics on YouTube and we pop up, but you can search Ben Burgis on YouTube and he will come up.
Yeah. And so that's a great point. I'll put the description in our episode description, links to a bunch of Ben Burgis's stuff. Again, really, to me, a very influential person, has helped me in my understanding of leftism a lot, especially this year. It's just invaluable voice in the left movement here. He's also, I do believe, a member of the DSA and an active participant in the Democratic Socialists of America. All three of us are, as we mentioned, and we also encourage everyone who does want to get more involved or learn more about it. I'll put a link in the episode description as well that'll get you into the DSA universe. So I want you to check that out as well. So anyway, everybody, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you at the next one. So
Definitely.
Thanks.
All right, guys, without further ado, we love you, and keep listening to us because we need you in our lives.
All right. Let's take us out with a beat, Decatur. One of Decatur's fresh beats.